Before Herb Baumeister would become a prolific, horrible life-taker, he was a pillar of his community. He was a doting father and a loving husband. His neighbors enjoyed spending time with him because he was high energy and threw great parties. But what people didn't know from outward appearances was that he was schizophrenic and had been diagnosed at a young age. He also had a deep obsession with death and dying that he could never quite shake. This morbid obsession ultimately took over, and he would go on to end the lives of nearly 24 young men in Indiana, burying the majority of them on his property, known as Fox Hollow Farm. When an investigation into these missing young men in Indiana pointed to Herb Baumeister as the primary suspect, Baumeister fled his property and ultimately ended his own life. In the note he left, he stated that the reason he was taking his own life was because his business was failing, and so was his marriage. He didn't confess to any of the unalivings or give investigators any indication of how many people he had unalived or where they were. He didn't provide any closure to anyone, he just took his own life, and that was that. While investigators conducted a thorough search of the Fox Hollow Farms property and found over 5,000 human bone fragments, identifying a number of victims, they believe that there are more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farms that may never be uncovered. Our story picks up over a decade later when two new owners purchase Fox Hollow Farms. Almost immediately, some very strange things start happening in and around the property. They recorded a famous audio recording inside the property, which, combined with the other strange things they had seen, led them to believe that Fox Hollow Farms is haunted. Before we get into their story, if you're interested in strange, dark, and mysterious content like what I'm promising on today's episode, then you've come to the right place because this is the type of content that I produce 3 to 4 times a week. If that interests you, please gently click the like button and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these uploads every week. Let's dive in. In 2006, Rob, Vicky Graves, and their 2 teenage sons were tired of the fast-paced city lifestyle and decided to look for some property in suburban Indiana to escape that busy lifestyle. While looking at real estate in some of the nicer suburbs of Indiana, they found a property called Fox Hollow Farms, a huge sprawling estate selling for an unbelievably cheap price. They contacted a real estate agent who said, "Yeah, we'd love to give you a tour of the place. It's up for sale. No one's occupying it right now. It's owned by an investor, but they are looking to sell, obviously." They were open-minded. It seemed too good to be true, but they decided to take a look. When they arrived at the property, it was beautiful. It was everything they wanted in their dream home. It had an indoor swimming pool, loads of bedrooms and bathrooms, and was basically a mansion. As they walked around the property, Rob spoke to his wife, Vicky, and they both wondered what was wrong with the place, since it seemed perfect. Rob started to wonder if he had heard of this place on TV before. He had an epiphany and realized that Fox Hollow Farm was the home of one of Indiana's most notorious serial life-takers, Herb Baumeister. Rob stopped the real estate agent during the tour and asked, "Hey, this is a beautiful home, but is this the home of Herb Baumeister?" The real estate agent, almost expecting this to be brought up, said, "Yes, that's why it's still on the market. People are unwilling to purchase this home, even though the investor who bought it in the 90s following the tragedy that was the Herb Baumeister case had gutted the whole residence, removing all the remnants of what it used to look like when Herb Baumeister was living there. Nobody wanted it because Herb Baumeister had unalived nearly 24 young men and buried them on the property." Investigators were still finding pieces of bone on the property and didn't really know how many victims there were. It was a spooky place to live. The real estate agent said, "That's why it's so cheap. The property is beautiful and well kept, but no one wants to be here because of the history. Why don't you and your wife talk about it? We can leave if you guys aren't comfortable with this." Ultimately, they decided to purchase the property. A couple of weeks later, Rob, Vicky, and their 2 teenage sons moved into Fox Hollow Farms, and they loved it. Their 2 teenage sons especially loved swimming in the pool and often tracked in dirt and gravel into the pool area. One day, Vicky was vacuuming up some of this dirt and gravel around the pool when her vacuum suddenly cut out. The power cord had come undone. She thought she had yanked on the cord and pulled it out of the outlet. She plugged it back in and continued vacuuming. It went out again, surprising her because she had been careful not to yank on the cord. She turned around and saw that the cord and the outlet were separated by about a foot, as if it had been yanked out hard. Wondering if she had yanked it out again, she checked to make sure the connection was secure and plugged it back in. As she vacuumed, she watched the cord pop out of the socket again, this time as if it had jumped out due to a surge of electricity. Startled, she dropped the vacuum. Rob worked at a car dealership and one of his employees, Joe, was chronically late. Rob asked Joe why he was always late, and Joe explained that he lived over an hour away and needed to find somewhere closer to live. Rob offered the apartment attached to their residence at Fox Hollow Farms, which was unoccupied. Joe agreed, and a couple of days later, Rob helped Joe move into the new apartment, spending the whole day moving boxes and furniture. In just a few hours, they moved everything into Joe's apartment. Rob left, and Joe was exhausted. It was just him and his dog Fred. Joe decided to crash for the night, laying down in bed and falling asleep. That night, he had a dream where he was being chased by someone. He didn't know what it was, but it caused him to act out his dream like sleepwalking. He jumped out of bed and started running as if he needed to escape the apartment, but he was half dreaming. He ran into the door frame, fell to the ground, knocked over a glass, and cut his hands badly. He came to, looked around, and wondered what had just happened. A couple of days later, Vicky came home and found Rob painting the side of the house. They stopped and talked about how beautiful it would look when the painting was done. Out of the corner of her eye, Vicky saw something in the forest at the edge of their property. It was a man in a red t-shirt, just standing and looking at their property. As she looked at him, he turned around and walked farther into the forest. Before she could say anything to Rob, the man had vanished into the woods. She said, "Rob, I just saw someone standing on our property in a red shirt. He was right over there." Rob responded, "Well, honestly, we moved into a home with a notorious history. We should expect that some people might want to sneak onto our property to get a look at it." They walked over to where Vicky had seen the man in red, but no one was there. They called out, "Hey, is anybody here?" but got no response. Though it was unsettling, they decided this might be the reality of living there. People might spy on them because of the home's notoriety. Later that night, Joe was in his apartment doing dishes. It was late, around 10 or 11 p.m., when he heard a knock on the door. His hands were wet, so he turned off the water and yelled, "Just a second." As he dried his hands, the knocking became louder and more aggressive. He shouted, "Hold on, I'm drying my hands." He assumed it was Vicky or Rob. As he walked to the door, the knocking continued incessantly. He finally opened the door, but no one was there. The knocking had been happening right up until he opened the door, and no one was standing there. He immediately became cautious. He looked around, even stepped out onto the front steps, but saw no one. Joe had been in the apartment for about 3 weeks and had developed a habit of taking his dog, Fred, for a walk along the driveway in the evenings. The driveway was well lit and long, leading up to the main house. After the recent unsettling events, he decided to take a walk to clear his head. He figured he could check if the lights were on at Rob and Vicky's house, which might indicate they had been the ones knocking on his door. However, the house was dark, they were asleep. As he walked, his dog suddenly stopped and took off into the tree line. Before Joe followed, he saw a man in a red t-shirt at the edge of the forest. The man's back was turned, and he was walking into the forest. As Joe watched, the man seemed to disappear. His dog was heading straight for the man in red, so Joe, though terrified, ran after his dog. He found his dog a few feet into the woods, facing Joe and cowering. Joe turned and saw the man in red standing right next to him, looking directly at him. Joe panicked, ran back to his apartment with his dog, and locked all the doors and windows. For the rest of the night, Joe checked his window, looking outside, unsure if he had really seen the man in red. He thought he might be imagining things after the earlier events. The next morning, he told Rob and Vicky about the previous night, from the knocking on the door to seeing the man in red. Vicky became emotional, saying she had also seen a man in red in the same area Joe described. That night, Joe was in his apartment, still on edge from the previous night. He decided not to take his usual walk with his dog. As he stayed inside, he heard knocking on the door again. He yelled, "Who is it?" but got no answer. But the knocking continues, and it's one of those knockers, the actual knocker on the outside of the door, that's being hit over and over again. He can see the door shaking from how hard it's being banged. Finally, after poking his head out and seeing no one, he rips the door open, but no one is there. He looks at the door, and the knocker is perpendicular to the ground as if someone is holding it up, but no one is there. As he watches, it swings down and knocks the door one last time. He slams the door shut, locks it, and is absolutely petrified. He then sees the doorknob start to turn. He can hear the sound of the spring tightening as the doorknob slowly turns all the way into the open position. The door is locked, but the doorknob has been twisted. He's looking at the door, and then there's silence. Suddenly, it bursts open, breaking the lock, but no one is outside. He freezes for a second and then runs out of his apartment to see who is doing this, but no one is there. When he turns around and looks into his apartment, he sees a man in white, not in red, who is soaked head to toe, screaming and running towards him. The man runs out of the apartment, past him, and vanishes into the air. Joe doesn't stick around. He grabs his dog and runs to Rob and Vicky's house to tell them what happened. Joe, Rob, and Vicky are so scared that they stop trying to rationalize that this wasn't a ghost. Instead, they try to convince themselves that this is a friendly ghost, possibly the victims of Herb Baumeister, who were tormented by him but are now trapped here. They tell themselves that the man Joe saw in the apartment was a victim escaping from Herb Baumeister. They believe the man in red was another victim. They're dealing with the victims because so many people had their lives snuffed out here. While it isn't calming them, it helps them create a narrative to understand what is happening. They start to believe that the property is haunted by the victims of Herb Baumeister, who are acting out their final moments or leading them to understand what happened. That night, Joe, Rob, and Vicky begin researching the known victims of Herb Baumeister. As they scroll through the pictures, Joe stops them on one and says, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. It looks exactly like the man who was soaking wet and screaming." This confirms to the three of them that the entity they're experiencing is indeed the victims. They feel reassured, though still scared, that these are the victims. They aggressively research the Baumeister case and realize that there are likely more victims buried on the property, lending more credibility to the idea that the property is haunted by Herb Baumeister's victims. After a couple of days without much activity, Joe decides to go for a walk in the woods where the man in red had been seen by Vicky and himself. In broad daylight, he walks with his dog and finds a human bone, a femur, sitting on the trail in plain sight. Joe feels like the bone was left there for him to discover, possibly by the man in red, a victim of Herb Baumeister. They believe that when the bone is analyzed, it will be identified as another victim, perhaps the man in red. Rob calls the lead detective from the Baumeister case to report the bone. The detective agrees to come to the property and explain where the events occurred, where people were buried, and what they're dealing with. The majority of the unlivings happened in the swimming pool, where Baumeister would lure young men to swim and then strangle them. The pool area was eerie, with mannequins and party outfits placed around it. A couple of days later, Joe is working at his computer and hears a metallic scraping sound from the kitchen. He finds all the knives from the butcher block lined up neatly in the sink. He notices fresh cut marks on the kitchen island's wood. Joe thinks a victim might be telling him they were harmed with a knife in the kitchen. He records the room with his iPhone, asking questions. After ensuring silence, he asks, "Is anybody here?" and hears nothing. His dog starts growling, reacting to something in the room. Joe feels silly but listens to the recording later. After asking about the kitchen, he hears a response. The married one. Joe realizes the only married person involved in the case was Herb Baumeister, the life taker himself. Joe concludes that Herb Baumeister is haunting the property along with his victims. I'd love to hear what you think is going on at Fox Horrifying. Is this a haunting by Herb Baumeister himself, or is it just a big hoax? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please drop your thoughts in the comments section. Again, if you haven't already, please gently tap the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads that look and sound a lot like this one. That's going to do it, guys. Thank you for sticking around till the very end, and I will talk to you soon.